Welcome to Compact Warfare from CompactHistories.com, the show where we explore key moments from the history of conflict, from ancient battlefields to modern warfare. This is episode 83, the Battle of Edington. By the late 9th century, Anglo-Saxon England was under extraordinary pressure. The Viking raids that had begun as fast coastal attacks in the late 8th century had changed into something far more dangerous. Armed bands were no longer simply arriving, looting, and leaving. They were staying, campaigning, extracting tribute, and taking land. The most formidable of these forces was the army remembered in later English sources as the Great Heathen Army, which arrived in England in 865 and began a sustained campaign against the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria, East Anglia, and much of Mercia had already been overwhelmed before Wessex became the main target. Wessex, in the south and west of England, was not an isolated backwater. It was one of the strongest remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, with access to rich farmland, important routes, and a royal dynasty that had already shown military resilience. That made it valuable, but it also made it a problem for Viking leaders who wanted to dominate the island. Alfred became King of Wessex in 871 after the death of his elder brother Ethelred. He inherited not a peaceful throne, but a kingdom already at war. In the early years of his reign, Alfred fought a series of hard campaigns against Viking armies. Some battles were victories, others were costly setbacks, and the survival of Wessex often depended as much on negotiation as on battlefield success. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records repeated fighting in this period, showing a kingdom forced to respond again and again to mobile, experienced opponents. One of Alfred's main enemies was Guthrum, a Danish Viking leader whose ambitions went far beyond raiding. Guthrum and his forces had already operated across eastern and central England before turning renewed attention towards Wessex. Viking warfare at this stage was not just about charging into battle. It involved winter camps, sudden movements, negotiated truces, and political pressure. Armies could appear where they were least expected, especially when a kingdom believed a temporary peace had bought it time. This was the danger facing Alfred. Wessex was still standing, but it was not secure. Its king had fought, bargained, and survived, yet the Viking presence in England had not been broken. Guthrum understood that if Wessex could be forced into submission, the last major independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom might fall. Alfred understood something equally stark. If Wessex collapsed, there might be no organized English resistance left strong enough to recover. That pressure set the stage for one of the most dramatic reversals in early English history. The crisis did not begin with an open battle on a chosen field. It began with a surprise strike, launched in the dead of winter, when Alfred's enemies moved before he was ready. In January 878, Guthrum made his move. The Viking army struck at Chippenham in Wiltshire, where Alfred had been staying during the Christmas season. The timing was ruthless. Midwinter was not when armies usually expected major campaigning, and the attack took Alfred's kingdom by surprise. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Viking army stole itself to Chippenham after Twelfth Night, harried the land of the West Saxons, and forced many people into submission. Alfred escaped, but only with a small band of followers. The blow was devastating. Chippenham was not merely a target on a map. It was a royal centre, and Guthrum's seizure of it sent a clear message. Alfred's authority had been shaken at its core. Many West Saxons submitted to the Viking army, either because they had no choice or because the king's position seemed hopeless. For a ruler whose power depended on the loyalty of landholders, warriors, and local communities, this was a disaster. Alfred withdrew into the wetlands of Somerset, especially the marshlands around Athelney. This was not a romantic retreat, whatever later legend made of it. It was survival. The Somerset levels were difficult country, broken by water, reeds, raised ground, and hidden routes. For a small fugitive force, such terrain offered protection. For a larger Viking army, it was awkward, unfamiliar, and hard to control. Alfred had been driven from the open centres of power, but he had not been captured, and that mattered enormously. The famous story of Alfred burning the cakes belongs to later legend, not firm contemporary evidence. but its popularity points to something real in the memory of this crisis. Alfred was imagined not as a distant king on a throne, but as a man reduced to hiding, dependent on ordinary shelter, and forced to rebuild from humiliation. The legend may be doubtful, but the danger was not. Wessex had come close to collapse. Athelney became the base from which Alfred began to recover. The area's defensible landscape gave him time, and time was exactly what he needed. He could send messages, gather loyal supporters, observe Viking movements, and prepare a counterstroke. The Ashmolean Museum notes that Athelney was the stronghold in the marshes from which Alfred launched the counterattack that led to victory at Edington. Guthrum had won the opening move of 878. He had seized Chippenham, scattered Alfred's authority, and pushed the West Saxon king into hiding. Yet he had not finished the job. Alfred was alive, and in a political culture built around personal lordship, oaths, and military followings, a living king could still call men back to him. The struggle now became a test of whether Alfred could turn survival into resistance. Alfred's months in the marshes were crucial because they transformed him from a fugitive into the centre of a renewed campaign. Athelney was not a grand fortress in the later medieval sense. Its strength lay in its position. Surrounded by wet ground and difficult approaches, it allowed Alfred and his followers to operate without being easily trapped. From there, they could strike, vanish, gather intelligence, and keep alive the idea that Wessex had not surrendered. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says Alfred held out with a small force in woods and moor fastnesses. That phrase captures the nature of his resistance. This was not yet the great mustering of the West Saxon army. It was a lower-level struggle, fought from marginal ground, using mobility and local knowledge. Alfred's followers would have included household warriors, loyal nobles, and men from areas still willing to resist Viking domination. This period also reveals an important fact about early medieval kingship. Alfred was not powerful simply because he wore a crown. He needed men to answer his summons, fight under his command, and believe that his cause was still viable. After Chippenham, that belief had been badly damaged. Each successful act of resistance helped repair it. Alfred had to show that he was not merely hiding, but preparing. The practical challenges were enormous. Messages had to move through contested territory. Supporters had to be persuaded that a rising was possible. Food, weapons, and horses had to be found. Guthrum's army held the advantage of momentum, but the Vikings also faced a problem. They could occupy centres and receive submissions, but controlling every village, trackway, and marshland refuge was another matter. Alfred exploited that gap. Athelney's later association with Alfred became powerful in English memory. He founded a monastery there after his recovery, and the nearby discovery of the Alfred jewel in 1693 helped strengthen the connection between the region and his reign. The jewel itself dates to Alfred's rule and bears an inscription meaning, "Alfred ordered me to be made," making it one of the most famous surviving objects associated with him. By spring 878, Alfred was ready to move beyond resistance. The aim was no longer just to survive in the marshes. It was to gather the fighting men of Wessex and confront Guthrum in the open. According to later accounts based on the chronicle tradition, Alfred summoned men from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire, the heartlands still able to support him. This was a dangerous step. If too few came, his last chance might disappear. If enough answered, Wessex could rise again. The answer came in Alfred's favour. Men did gather. The king who had disappeared into the marshes now emerged with an army. Alfred's recovery depended on the fyrd, the military force raised from the free men and landholders of his kingdom. This was not a permanent standing army in the modern sense. It was a levy, called out when the king needed men for defence or campaign. The system relied on obligation, local organisation, and trust that the king's summons was worth answering. In 878, that trust was tested under extreme pressure. The mustering of Alfred's army was a political act as much as a military one. Every man who came was effectively declaring that Guthrum had not won. Every local leader who answered Alfred's summons was helping to rebuild the authority that had seemed to crumble after Chippenham. The army that formed around Alfred was therefore more than a collection of spears and shields. It was Wessex reassembling itself. The chronicle tradition places Alfred's gathering at Egbert's Stone before moving to Iley Oak and then towards Edington. The exact identification of some of these places is debated, which is hardly surprising given the age of the sources and the changing landscape. What matters is the movement itself. Alfred was no longer waiting in the marshes. He was advancing eastwards towards the Viking army that had humiliated him months earlier. Guthrum's force was experienced and dangerous. Viking armies of this period were highly mobile, accustomed to campaigning across kingdoms, and skilled at exploiting political weakness. They could fight in the open, occupy fortified sites, and use fear as a weapon. Guthrum had already shown strategic boldness by attacking Chippenham in winter. Alfred could not assume that numbers alone, even if he had them, would be enough. The likely battlefield was near Edington in Wiltshire, though the older name Ethandune appears in early sources and the precise location has been debated. Modern discussion often links the battle with the area around present-day Edington, not far from the chalk uplands of Wiltshire. What is clear is that Alfred forced a confrontation after weeks of preparation and recovery. World History Encyclopedia summarizes the battle as a decisive encounter in May 878 between Alfred of Wessex and Guthrum's Viking army. The march to Edington also changed the psychology of the war. Guthrum had expected submission, fragmentation, and perhaps the final absorption of Wessex into the Viking-controlled world of eastern England. Instead, Alfred had returned with an army large enough to risk battle. For Guthrum, this meant the crisis had not ended at Chippenham. For Alfred, it meant that months of hardship now came down to one brutal test. There would be no clever escape in the marshes now, no hiding among reeds and waterways. The armies would meet in the old fashion, shield against shield, with the future of Wessex pressed into the front rank. The Battle of Edington was probably fought in May 878. Like many early medieval battles, its exact tactical details are thinly recorded. We do not have a minute-by-minute account, no complete order of battle, and no reliable casualty list. What survives is the essential outcome. Alfred met Guthrum's army, defeated it, and changed the direction of the war. The lack of detail should not make the battle seem vague or minor. It simply reflects the nature of the surviving sources. The fighting itself was almost certainly dominated by the shield wall. Both Anglo-Saxon and Viking forces fought in dense formations, with men packed close together behind overlapping shields. Spears, axes, swords, and knives did their work at close range. Battles of this kind were not graceful contests of individual heroics. They were contests of pressure, endurance, discipline, and nerve. A line might hold for hours, then collapse suddenly once fear, exhaustion, or casualties opened a gap. Alfred's army had one great advantage: purpose. These were men fighting not for plunder, but for the survival of their kingdom, homes, and lordship ties. That does not make them saints, and it certainly does not make the Vikings cartoon villains. Guthrum's warriors were professional, hardened, and formidable, but Alfred had managed to turn a scattered kingdom into an army with a shared cause. At Edington, that mattered. The Chronicle says Alfred fought against the whole Viking army and put it to flight. After the defeat, Guthrum's forces withdrew to a fortified place, where Alfred besieged them. This is an important detail because it shows that Edington was not simply a battlefield victory, followed by instant peace. Alfred pursued the advantage. He did not allow Guthrum to regroup freely or drift away to raid again. He pinned the defeated army down and forced the crisis to continue under his terms. The siege lasted about 2 weeks, according to the Chronicle. Inside the stronghold, Guthrum's men faced hunger, pressure, and the knowledge that their campaign had failed. Outside, Alfred had to maintain discipline, supplies, and momentum. A failed siege could have undone the victory, but Alfred held firm. Eventually, Guthrum sought terms. This was the real breaking point. Guthrum had not merely lost a clash of shield walls, he had lost the ability to dictate the future of Wessex. Alfred, who only months earlier had been hiding in the marshes with a small band, now stood as the victorious king receiving the submission of the army that had nearly destroyed him. Edington did not end Viking power in England. That would be far too simple. But it did end Guthrum's immediate attempt to conquer Wessex. The last major independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom had survived its most dangerous moment. After Edington, Alfred chose settlement as well as victory. Guthrum gave hostages, swore oaths, and accepted baptism. The chronicle says that Guthrum came to Alfred at Alla, near Athelney, with leading men from his army, and that Alfred stood as his godfather. The ceremony mattered because conversion was not merely personal religion in this context. It was diplomacy, submission, and political theatre, all at once. Guthrum's baptismal name was Ethelstan, a striking sign of his entry into a Christian political world. The ceremony was followed by further formalities at Wedmore, which is why the peace is often called the Treaty or Peace of Wedmore. Strictly speaking, no written text of a Treaty of Wedmore survives. What survives separately is the later Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, which set out boundaries and legal arrangements between Alfred's territory and Guthrum's. Rochester Cathedral's summary notes the distinction between the peace known from narrative sources and the later treaty tradition that helped define the Danelaw. The settlement allowed Guthrum to withdraw and eventually rule in East Anglia. That might seem surprisingly generous after such a dangerous invasion, but Alfred was being practical. Total destruction of a defeated Viking army may not have been possible, and even if it had been, it would not have ended every Viking threat. By binding Guthrum through oaths, hostages, baptism, and territorial agreement, Alfred turned an enemy into a contained neighbour. For Wessex, the consequences were enormous. The kingdom had not only survived, it had also gained time. Alfred used that time to strengthen his defences, reorganise military service, develop fortified burhs, improve naval responses, and support learning and administration. Edington was therefore not the end of Alfred's achievement, but the hinge on which the rest of his reign turned. The victory also shaped the longer story of England. In 878, there was no single kingdom of England. There were fractured Anglo-Saxon territories, Viking-controlled regions, and contested borders. By preserving Wessex, Edington preserved the one kingdom capable of leading a later recovery. Alfred's successors, especially Edward the Elder and Ethelfled of Mercia, would build on that survival to push back Viking power and expand West Saxon influence. That is why Edington matters so much. It was not the largest battle ever fought on English soil, and many of its details remain uncertain. Yet its outcome was decisive. If Alfred had lost, Wessex might have gone the way of Northumbria and East Anglia, absorbed into a Viking-dominated political order. Instead, Alfred won, Guthrum submitted, and the survival of Wessex made the later creation of England possible. The Battle of Edington was born from crisis, fought after near collapse, and remembered because it turned disaster into recovery. Alfred did not win because fate had chosen him. He won because he endured, organised, marched, fought, and then used victory wisely. In that sense, Edington was not only a battle, it was the moment Wessex refused to disappear. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Warfare, part of the Compact Histories Network. Please don't forget to follow or subscribe wherever you are listening so that you don't miss any future episodes. And consider leaving us a rating or a review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find new episodes at compacthistories.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, science, mysteries, true crime, and disasters. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/warfare and click on the coffee cup to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.